Over the past few weeks, I've been kind of sharing a little bit about my story, and so you can have a chance to get to know me. Of course, I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to get together and learn more about you. We've already been hearing some great things, hearing about your stories and the ways that God is at work in your life, and it's amazing. Last week, I shared with you my favorite scripture, which is Ephesians 2:10, that we are God's masterpiece, that He created us anew to do the good things that God prepared for us along the way. And so this week, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about a part of my family's history, part that was a very difficult and tiring journey for our family, so you can kind of understand a little bit more who we are. We're going to talk about it as calling it a journey of lament. Now, lament is a biblical thing, and we see that there's a book, Lamentation, so it tells you that there's some sort of spiritual act of lament. We see there's about 1/3 of all the Psalms are Psalms of lament, where they're crying out to God. So let's think about what this idea of lament means. It's not something we use all the time in our everyday vernacular. So let's look at what it means. So a common dictionary definition is to mourn or grieve over something or someone. So that's what lament is. And so when I was, a few years ago, I was in seminary classes, and I took a class on joy and sorrow. And it's kind of as I was coming out of this difficult time in my life. And so I used that class as kind of a therapy session. So a lot of this you'll see is kind of taken from that. So there'll be some quotes. But if you want to read the paper, you can do that later. It's a lot more heady. But here's some other definitions, though, that I discovered of lament. So a repeated cry of pain, rage, and sorrow, and grief that emerges in the midst of suffering and alienation. Another one is a cry of the innocent. So when you're lamenting, you feel that you are innocent. You're innocent. There's some people who feel that they have been unjust grievances and all for vindication. So you're longing for something to come out of it. It's a protest. So lament, your protest is a form of petition seeking to take God to court to make one's case. So you're coming to God and saying, why is this happening? It shouldn't happen because of this, this, and this. It's also an expression of confusion and disappointment to God, asking Him to enter into our story and make right what has been wrong. So that's your basic bunch of definitions of lament. And we'll see that today's story, we'll see a woman that is definitely in lament. She's having a very difficult time. It says, as Jesus approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. So here is a woman who's lost her husband. She's struggling with that loss. And in the midst of losing her husband, her son then dies. And so she's grieving these terrible losses for herself. And what makes it even more difficult, back then, women had very little status, that everything they had and all that they were really tied to that of their husband. The husbands were the providers and the heads of the family. And so when the husband were to die, these women were left desolate. And the only way they could survive is that their sons would take on the responsibility of caring for their mother. So now here's this woman whose husband has died, and now her caregiver, her son, has also died. And so her life is in utter ruin, and she doesn't know what will come of it. So in May of 2017, our family's life took an unexpected turn. Shook our family to its core. Our youngest son, Henry, who was 3 at the time, was having reoccurring low-grade fevers. His mood was continually irritable and fussy. He was wanting to be held at all times and was refusing to walk. And we were wondering what was going on. So we set up an appointment with his pediatrician, who looked at him and was trying to figure it out. And so she sent us to go have blood work done and to have some x-rays. And then a few hours later, we get a call from her saying she wants to have Henry admitted to the children's hospital downtown. And our kids have been normally pretty healthy, and so this was uncharted territory for us. And so we took our son down to the hospital, and he started seeing a bunch of different doctors. They were trying to figure out what was going on with him. And of all the specialists that we were seeing, the one that we least wanted to have any sort of extended interaction with was with the pediatric oncologist. But he took us to a conference room and he showed us the results of Henry's CAT scans. And as it went down, a large tumor was appearing in his chest. We sat there in shock, as if the hope of the world had been sucked out of the room. So Henry was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma, a rare and deadly form of pediatric cancer, which had metastasized in his adrenal gland. And that began our journey of lament. And I know we're not the only ones who go through these difficult times. We've all of you have experienced pain and tragedy in your life, have illnesses that have affected you or people that you love, people you know have lost their lives to death, have broken relationships with family and friends, people that you once held dear are now distant, people that you love are far from Jesus and you want them to return. We know the struggles of substance abuse or physical abuse or accidents and violence. Life is full of tragedy. And unfortunately, most Christians now, we don't go down this journey of lament. We think we need to just kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and just say we've got the joy down in our hearts. We're just going to power through it. In fact, this idea of lament was kind of like minimized by the early reformers. They thought that it was a dangerous thing. They feared that Christians, if they were to go through prolonged times of lament, they would start to doubt Christ's love. But this ended up creating a culture where our sorrows and our doubts become inappropriate. Timothy Keller says that Christians were taught not to weep or cry, but to show God their faith through unflinching, joyful acceptance of His will. But he says that that's is not right for us to simply say to a person who's in grief and sorrow that they just need to pull themselves together. That we shouldn't just say, "Oh, you're going through a hard time. Just pull yourself up. Everything's going to be okay," because that's not always true. Eugene Peterson, he says that our prayers are going to end in praise. That one day we will all be praising God together, but it's going to take a while. And so don't rush it. Don't rush through the pain and the struggle. It may take years, even decades, before certain prayers arrive at hallelujahs. But here's the good news, that while we go through these difficult times, Jesus, He joins us on this journey of lament. We see in this story as Jesus approached town gate, He was there. He arrived there just as His crowd was coming. This crowd was going out. And it was no coincidence. It wasn't like Jesus, oh, whoa, there's a funeral here. It wasn't a coincidence that this is happening. Jesus doesn't show up by accident. But he shows up at the right time and at the right place. Now, it might not feel like the right time and the right place for us. We think Jesus should show up at this time in this place, but it doesn't always feel like He's there when we want Him to. And I'm sure that this woman, she prayed that God would show up when her husband was sick. And she probably prayed that God would show up when her son was sick. But that's not when Jesus showed up. He shows up when this woman is about to bury her son. In the darkest moments, he shows up. Henry, his cancer treatment required an intense roadmap of treatment. It's about a year and a half of treatment, 5 rounds of chemotherapy to take and shrink that tumor. and then it was surgically removed. He had what was called 2 bone marrow transplants, where they took out some of his white blood cells, and then they kind of eradicated all that was in him, and then reintroduced it to his body to help restart his system. And so during those procedures, he was in the hospital for about 3 to 4 weeks each time. 2 weeks of radiation therapy aimed at just wiping away where that tumor was. Then he went through 6 rounds of immunotherapy, which included 5 weeks and a barrage of at-home medication, which was really intense to try to figure out. So we spent about a year and a half making the Children's Hospital our second home. And during that time, we went through a lot of physical and emotional and spiritual haze, just wondering what was going on. It was difficult to watch the joy of life be drained from a 3-year-old, to see his health bounce up and down like a yo-yo, and wondering why God would allow that to happen. And it brought just a bunch of mixed emotions of grief, sometimes, and gratitude at others, protest and worry, doubt and trust. Probably the thing that got us through the most was a book by Max Lucado. He's an amazing author, and he wrote a book called You'll Get Through This. And it's the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. And Joseph went through some crazy things. He was also murdered by his brothers, who then sold him into slavery. Ended up going to jail for wrongful imprisonment, being accused of something. Spent years in jail wondering what was going to happen and not just there waiting. But at the end of his life, as he reflects back, he said that God intended it all for good. And so Max Lucado doesn't sugarcoat people's pain, but he affirms that life is hard, yet still God is good. And this is kind of the mantra of the book here. He says, you'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this best for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive. Don't despair either. With God's help, you'll get through this. When we began to tell people about Henry's diagnosis, we were overwhelmed by the response. We think that people would be sympathetic, but they shocked us with how well they cared for us and our family. They filled our cupboards with food. They showered our children, all of our children, with love and care. They helped care for some of our financial burdens. They just rallied around us in ways that God's people should. And it was through these people that we were able to see Jesus through our journey of lament. And I'm sure that your journeys have also been arduous and emotional. And you're wondering if Jesus is there in the midst of your struggles. Does Jesus hear your cry? Sometimes it feels like he's far away from your suffering. And this journey of lament can be tiring and painful, and things don't turn out the way you expect them. But at some point along the journey, in the most unexpected ways, Jesus shows up. He shows up offering compassion and joy to the weary traveler. So in our story, we see that Jesus shows up and he brings compassion to this woman. It says that when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Jesus sees this funeral, and his heart breaks for this woman. His heart breaks because he sees that death has claimed another soul, and that's not the way that it should be. His heart breaks because he sees that this woman's life is in ruin. His heart breaks because he loves her so much. As we walk through this diagnosis with Henry, we sat a lot of times in the hospital room, clinging to hope and not sure what was going on. And during those long nights, we would just offer prayers to God and sought him in this. And that And there he brought compassion to us. And some of the best ways we saw God's compassion was interacting with the people who worked at the children's hospital. I like to refer to them as some of the greatest people you never wish you'd meet. They were people who dedicate their time to fighting for children to have a chance to live. They were people who saw us in our darkest times and just loved us and cared for us and worked tirelessly, not just to care for our son, but to care for us as a family and as individuals. These people saw us in our highs and lows, and they shared our joys and our struggles along the process. It was just beautiful. Here's some of the people that we met was like Dr. Griffin, who would, every time he'd see him, say, Hank the Tank. Or Courtney was Henry's favorite nurse who would always make him laugh, and she taught him how to spell the word poop. Important for a 3-year-old. Judith would take him on trips around the hospital dressed as superheroes. Peter we discovered he was one of the nurses who lived just down the street from us and ended up a couple years later becoming the nurse at his elementary school. Kelly would draw pictures of superheroes and Star Wars characters. Anne, who was a fellow Christian, would just talk and pray with us. Becky was a child life specialist, and her job was just to help these kids feel like kids in the midst of doing such grown-up things. And these are the people that dedicate their lives to helping these hurting kids and helping parents and families see their end. And through that, they brought compassion to our hurting family. And I know that on your journey of lament, hopefully you'll experience the compassion of Christ through his people, as people pray for you during your difficult journey, as they sit with you and they just hear what's going on, and they sit in silence with you, be with you, as they maybe meet your needs and send you encouragement. We as God's people are called to be compassionate to others, to extend compassion to people during those times. And that's why we gather money together to buy coats for people, to show God's compassion. We put together these hygiene kits to show compassion. As Tom talked about, this man at the recycling center who's just experiencing the compassion of Christ in ways that this church is caring for. And then, so in the midst of our journey, Jesus also offers us joy. It's a hard thing to imagine, joy in the journey of lament. It says that he went up and touched the bear where they were carrying him on, and the bear stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And that man sat up and began to talk. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. In that instance, Jesus brings joy into this woman's life. Her weeping has turned to joy. Her mourning has turned to dancing. As we gather Wednesday night, we kind of imagine this scene. We talked about what would have happened afterwards. And they said that everyone imagined that they would all go back to this woman's house in just a time of amazing celebration. Now, before I go on too far, as amazing as it is, not every story ends like that. Jesus doesn't always bring the people we love back to life in the ways that we expect them. Not all the roads find the healing that we want. Not all our relationships are going to be mended. But still, in the midst of that, we can discover joy. Not the joy that the dictionary promises of happiness and elation, but a joy, a deeper joy that God has for us. Joy as an emotion might seem fickle or fragile to withstand the assault of suffering and crushing magnitude of pain. So we just think we just have to have this fickle understanding. We're not going to get good. Yet the joy stands at the very core of Christian faith, life, and practice. Christian joy is the overwhelming expression of gratitude and praise that flows from a resolute, trusting heart that is immersed in hope in God. So we find our joy as we hope in God. So we don't rejoice because we're suffering. We never rejoice, oh, yay, I'm suffering. But we rejoice while suffering because of some good that is ours despite suffering. There is still good that is happening despite that. And each step along Henry's treatment came many challenges, but they also brought us one step closer to remission. As we continue to look to God, we sent him our cries of pain and confusion. He met us during that time. And, so for the past 3 years, he has been cancer-free, which we thank God for. But we still, at times, we wait in nervous anticipation, not sure what may happen in the future. But we trust that God is with Henry. We trust that God is with Lucy and Eli and Joel, and that he's with Dawn and I. And there are those days that worry is overwhelming. There's still some times of spiritual numbness pervades our souls. There are days or moments that doubt is triggered, but we press on with the joy that only Jesus can bring. So experiencing this joy doesn't mean that we wander around happy of our struggles. But as we don't make light of the hurt and tragedy that we feel, but we, as Max says, we remember that we will get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for good. That God uses this mess to bring his good news to the world. We see that in the story that after he brings this boy back to life, it says that these two crowds that had gathered, the crowd that was coming with Jesus and this crowd at this funeral, Saul was going on, and they were all filled with awe and praised God, saying, a great prophet has appeared among us. That God has come to help his people, and the news of Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. And so these groups, this celebration, this time of mourning has turned into celebration, and these two groups go out and they share the good news of Jesus, that Jesus brings compassion and joy, that God is praised even in the midst of this struggle, that Jesus is proclaimed and the good news of Christ is spread. During our time, we wanted it to have a purpose or meaning. Dawn and I just prayed and wondered about this, and we wanted God to use this to show people his eternal love in the midst of tragedy. We didn't know what our story was going to happen, how it was going to unfold, but we wanted people to see God's goodness even in the face of lament. So we set up this Facebook group and we began to share what we were going through. We shared the struggles that we were facing and the highs and lows, the sorrows and joys of walking a kid through cancer. And it was amazing to see the people that kind of came into this group, people that we have no idea how they found out about us or how they were connected to our family. People from varying spiritual walks. We had people who were strong Christians who loved Jesus. We had people who grew up Christian but had turned away from the faith, probably due to some tragic moment in their life. We had people who had no understanding or exposure to the gospel. People who came from different faiths. But yet, they all gathered together for a time of spiritual conversation and prayer and encouragement, asking God to care for this child. And so we were all gathered together, lifting our prayers to God, Christian and non-Christian alike. And this is where Jesus brings hope into the journey of lament. And I know we all are continually going through these journeys. We're crying out to God for hope, healing, searching for joy and peace, along probably wondering why our prayers seem silent or not being answered the way that we want. But remember that even sorrow is a God-given emotion. And Jesus felt sorrow. His heart broke for this woman. God feels sorrow. He wants us to walk through that. He wants us to embrace that sorrow. And he knows that his heart breaks for people in pain. But he also wants us to rest in the promise that he will show up. We don't know when. It'll probably be ways that we don't expect it. But even in the midst of that, he's going to offer us compassion and joy in the midst of uncertainty. And so by learning the practice of lament, we become the type of people who take seriously the pain and sadness of the world, but refuse to be crushed by it. As we journey through these painful times, we can use those things to help us both connect to God and to help others go through difficult situations as well. And if you're going through a difficult time, you want to share, I'd love to hear what's going on and to share your journey and to pray for you. I'd love to, if you want to come by sometime, meet with me at church, we can talk or go out for lunch or wherever. Set up a time and we can talk and I can hear your stories. Or if you want to talk to one of our deacons, feel free to come, find one of them and ask for some time of prayer. But through it all, through this all, I want to encourage you to trust, find joy that God is walking with us through this difficult journey, that God is on the journey of lament with us. And as he journeys with us, he offers us compassion and joy. And as Max says, he will use this mess for good. So I want to wrap up with just cling to these words because they meant so much to me. It meant so much to our family that you will get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use your mess for good. He will use that mess for good. So grip this promise like a parachute. Repeat it to yourself over and over again until it trumps the voice of fear and angst. God will use this mess for good.